Good afternoon. This is Dr. James Rippey. It is my pleasure to serve as the moderator for today's NutriBite webinar presentation. Our presenter today is, we are pleased to have Dr. Allison Steiber, who's the Chief Science Officer for the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. I will be formally introducing her in a few moments. Today's webinar is entitled The Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics Evidence Analysis Library, Leveraging This Resource to Maximize Your Efficacy. This is a webinar that is part of Conagra Nutrition. It's called the NutriBite webinar, and it's a series, and we have the mission that we believe that everyone deserves easy access to understandable, credible, and science-based nutrition information. We aim to provide cutting-edge knowledge that will enable health professionals to more effectively help their clients. Today is a CEU activity, and in order to give you the logistics for that, I would now like to turn the webinar over to my colleague, Amy Continelli.
Thank you, Dr. Rippey. CEUs, a link to obtain your continuing education credit certificate will be available on this webinar's page at conagranutrition.com and emailed to you within 2 days. A recording of the webinar and slides as a PDF will be available to download within 2 days at conagranutrition.com as well. And the presenter will answer questions at the end of the webinar. Please submit questions by using the chat dialog box on your computer screen. Thank you, Dr. Rippey.
Thank you, Amy. Since today is a CEU activity, there are a few details I have to handle. First of all, as I've already indicated, today's presenter is Dr. Allison Steiber, and I'm Dr. James Rippey, and I am the moderator today. Since this is a CEU activity, we need to give you the specific learning objectives. By participating in today's webinar, you should be able to do the following things. Number one, proficiently search and find evidence analyses pertinent to your practice. Number two, interpret the analysis to determine the strength of evidence behind the research question. Number three, translate findings to practice by review of a case study on efficacy of a single-serve meals on weight management. Number four, apply the learnings to improve the recommendations and education you provide to clients. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Dr. Allison Steiber. Dr. Steiber is a registered dietitian nutritionist and the Chief Science Officer at the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. As Chief Science Officer, Dr. Steiber leads the 12-person research, international, and scientific teams in research efforts, including conducting comparative effectiveness research, systematic reviews, and outcome research. Additionally, Dr. Steiber oversees the Academy's international efforts, the development of evidence-based practice guidelines, malnutrition research, standardized language, and the Research Fellowship Program. Dr. Steiber holds an adjunct faculty position at Case Western Reserve University, and prior to the Academy, was director of the Coordinated Dietetic Internship. She is an author on dozens of scientific research papers and represents the Academy at key research, scientific, and/or policy conferences. Dr. Steiber completed her dietetic internship and received her Master's of Science in Dietetics at the University of Kansas Medical Center and her doctorate in human nutrition at Michigan State University. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Allison Steiber.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rippey. I am very pleased to be here today to talk to you about the work that we do with our evidence analysis library and to give you a little bit of a case study and show you how to utilize the information that can be found on the evidence analysis library. So as Dr. Rippey has already gone through the objectives for this webinar, I will not repeat them, but I think it's important to note that I'm going to really focus on two things. One, how to how to utilize the evidence analysis library to the maximum. What is all the evidence that you can find there, and what are the different formats that that evidence can be found in? And then finally, how do we apply this to our everyday practice to ensure that you are having an evidence-based intervention or an evidence-based assessment pattern in your everyday practice? So let's begin. So this is a screenshot of our evidence analysis library. The evidence analysis library has been around for 11 years, and it is funded by the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. As you can see from this, it is a web page that you can go to that you can access either directly or through the eatrightpro.org. If we take a look at the evidence analysis library, it has a lot of wonderful resources to help you ensure your practice is as grounded in evidence as it absolutely can be. So let's take a look at how that evidence is formed and what you should expect to find there. So there are four main things that we think about when we think about the evidence analysis library. The first and maybe the very most important piece are the systematic reviews. Systematic reviews are rigorous forms of evidence that are the foundation of our evidence-based practice guidelines. They aggregate the existing literature in a particular very focused topic, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. The next piece that we have are evidence-based practice guidelines. And it's important to note that per the Institute of Medicine, which was the previous name of now the National Academy of Sciences, they say in their documents that every evidence-based practice guideline must be based on a systematic review. And so that's exactly what we do for all our evidence-based practice guidelines. We conduct a systematic review, and then that systematic review is the foundation of our recommendations. And the recommendations follow the nutrition care process steps, and we'll talk about that more in a minute as well. But it's not enough just to create evidence-based practice guidelines. We have to implement those guidelines into practice. And then we have to determine, does that practice work? Do the guidelines improve outcomes? Do they help you in your everyday practice? And in order to do that, we have to capture data. And so that's our next step, is that we implement those guidelines in your everyday practice, and then we encourage practitioners, no matter where you're practicing, to collect outcomes data, to really give us information about, did those guidelines work? And of course, testing efficacy is something the Academy is very vested in. I won't be talking about much today. However, you should know that we are spending a lot of time working through a systematic process so that every guideline that comes out of our evidence analysis library will go through rigorous testing to determine whether or not it results in improved outcomes when properly implemented. It's important to note that systematic reviews and thus evidence-based practice guidelines are only as good as the currently existing evidence. We don't create new evidence in this process. Rather, we take existing evidence, aggregate it, analyze it, and determine how it can shape our practice. And that's what evidence-based practice is all about. How well is the evidence analysis library utilized? So as of September 13th, we had over 25 million page views, and as you can see, it's used all over the world. We currently have users from 230 different countries. So let's start and take a look how you would actually utilize the evidence analysis library in your everyday practice. First of all, if you look at my blue arrow here showing the projects button, when you click on that button, you will have a pop-up screen that shows you over 42 different topics that you can analyze. Now, as you can imagine, some of these topics are ones that every 5 years get updated. For example, our diabetes type 1 and 2, or our oncology project, or our dyslipidemia project. These are projects that constantly are being updated and constantly being reviewed for the literature because the literature is evolving. There are other projects that are maybe more isolated and haven't been as updated, but one of our focuses for the new strategy for the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics is to continue to expand and upgrade our evidence analysis library. So while right now you may see a very heavy emphasis with medical nutrition therapy and chronic diseases, in the future you will see more topics that relate to public health, to food, food safety, and food security. So keep watching, because these topics will expand and grow. But it's important, as you look at each of these topics, to understand what is the evidence and what is the process that goes on behind each project. What processes are done to create the project and the evidence that you want to see and you want to utilize in your practice. So this slide shows us kind of a cascade for two different products. First, that systematic review that I told you is the foundation of all guidelines. And then the second is the guideline development process. And I will briefly go through each of these steps in the subsequent slides. But I wanted to show you them in whole so that you can get a sense that there is a huge amount of effort and a huge amount of rigor that goes behind each one of the projects that you will find on the evidence analysis library. So some projects are standalone systematic reviews, and I will show you an example of that at the end of our talk today. Most of our systematic reviews go on to become evidence-based practice guidelines, but not all. So let's look at the process of a systematic review. At a high level, you first formulate a question, which in the systematic review world is called a PICO question, population, intervention, comparison, and outcome. Then you gather all the research that exists that meet the search plan for that particular formulated question. Very trained, highly trained individuals called analysts critically appraise every article that meets the inclusion or exclusion criteria of the search plan that is done during the gathering research step. They appraise those articles and they give them a ranking depending on their bias, their risk of bias. Then we summarize all that information into these wonderful overview tables, and we actually give the level of evidence for every single PICO question a grade. And we develop a conclusion statement and give it a grade. And that way you as the practitioner can go and say, here's the question that was asked, here's the conclusion of all that aggregation of evidence, and here's how strongly I can put support behind that. So for example, if it's a grade 1 conclusion statement, you can know that there is a high level of evidence that supports that conclusion statement. Conversely, if it's a grade 5, you can know there was almost no evidence that existed from that search plan to answer that question. And so that would not be something that you would feel firmly is grounded in evidence. Now let's look at the guideline process. So you should know also that there's a tight connection between our evidence-based practice guidelines and the nutrition care process, the 4 steps of assessment, diagnosis, intervention, and monitoring and evaluation. All of our guidelines are based on those 4 steps. So for each guideline, we take those conclusion statements from the systematic review and we develop recommendations. We then send it out for both internal review and external review by content experts. Every guideline is approved by our evidence-based practice committee, and then we go into the guideline implementation phase, where we try to create resources and tools to help our practitioners implement the guidelines that are released. So let's look a little more deeply at this. These are done as a multidisciplinary team. So we have a wide range, including the most perhaps core of that is our volunteer members. So each project recruits from the members and even beyond a work group, and that work group is comprised of content experts. Perhaps they are clinicians or working in a public health area. Perhaps they are researchers who do research in this area. They each submit an application that is objectively graded by a subcommittee of our evidence-based practice committee, so again, volunteer members. They objectively grade each application, and the applications with the highest grade and the least conflict of interest are invited to join our work group. Then that work group is supported by a large group of staff. We have everything from a medical librarian to our evidence analysis that are paid and trained by the Academy. Of those, we have a lead analyst that is in charge of looking over all the work. We have a project manager that is also staff at the Academy, and sometimes the project manager and the lead analyst are the same person. Sometimes they're separately. We also have on staff our lead methodologist, and we have, of course, from the work group, we have the work group chair. So you can see it's a group effort to create each of these projects, and it takes considerable time and resources to do every project that comes out of our evidence analysis library. All right, so let's look at each of those steps that I described just briefly so that when you're interpreting each of these projects, you have a good understanding of what goes behind each one and you can utilize them to the maximum. So when we begin a new topic, we do what's called scoping and then evidence mapping. And you might ask why. And it's because most nutrition topics are multifactorial. They have a lot that goes into them. And so it's important for us to get a wide kind of 50,000-foot view of every topic and then narrow that down to ask very specific, relevant PICO questions. And so this is an example of evidence mapping. Evidence mapping goes a little bit beyond scoping in the fact that it tells you how much evidence, how many studies are between each of the points. So if you take a look at this figure and you look at, they put the target population at the top. The topic was undesirable weight loss. So the target might be older adults, both male and female, with unintended weight loss. Then you can see the intervention. Always we focus first on medical nutrition therapy by the registered dietitian nutritionist, but we also look at things like education, supplementation, appetite, etc. And so you can see the different interventions that have been listed out here. And then you can see the nutrition assessment on one side and monitoring and evaluation on the other. And from this, with the lines, you can see the amount of studies that involve the intervention and the outcomes. So in this case, when those group of interventions led to those group of outcomes, you could see there were 82 studies that were found between those two items. So it really gives you a sense of where the evidence currently exists. And then here are the questions that would come out of that kind of evidence mapping. So for example, the first research question might be what methods should be used to assess nutrient intake among older adults with unintended weight loss? And they want to look at both macro and micro. The second research question that came out would be what methods should be used to assess nutrition status among older adults with unintended weight loss. And again, looking at body composition, protein energy wasting, malnutrition, protein status. And so you get a sense of how the very specific questions are generated from a very broad topic like undesirable weight loss. Next, we take and we formulate a research plan. And that research plan includes what databases we're going to search through to find different papers that have been published on the topic. It includes the years of the search, how far back in the literature we're going to go. It includes the target population as depicted by the evidence mapping. It includes whether or not we're going to include case studies or whether we're just going to include randomized clinical trials. So it gives very specific information on what was included. And you can always find the search plan on all of our evidence analysis library topics on the library. So, and I'll show you a little bit more about that, but when you click on a particular topic, you can always go and see, well, why wasn't my favorite paper included in this analysis? And you'll see not only the search plan, but the results of the search plan and which papers were excluded and included and why. So maybe your favorite paper, research paper, was older than the parameters of the search plan. Or maybe it didn't have the right target population. So we try to be as transparent in this process as absolutely possible. And because it is such an important topic, and this is why it's replicable, why we can reproduce the search every time, be able to, if we use the same search plan with the same search terms, we should be able to replicate this, the results of this, no matter who does it. So how does the work group get involved with this? So they approve and oversee the search plan that has been developed, the search that was conducted, and the papers, the articles that came out. And so maybe as a content expert, they say, I noticed you didn't include, this paper didn't come out. Was that because it didn't meet the inclusion-exclusion criteria from the search plan, or is there another reason? Did we miss something? And so the work group's job is to really oversee and make sure that this is done well and that all the appropriate parameters are considered. And then, of course, the documentation of every single step as we go through this process. Step 3, as I noted before, is about appraising each of those articles. So the final group of articles that met the inclusion and exclusion criteria from the search plan are taken, and each article has data extracted from it in a very systematic and concrete approach using our data extraction tool. The data extraction tool, or more commonly called the DET, is a web-based tool that all our analysts use to critically appraise each article that is included in an analysis. And so let's talk a little bit more about how that works. So the evidence analysis, this is a paid consultant that works for the Academy that is trained very meticulously on the Academy's process. They are experts in critically analyzing articles. They must have at least a master's degree, but many of our analysts have PhDs. They are trained through our Academy Evidence Analysis Workshop, and they are always mentored by staff. If you look at the conversation boards that happen between our staff and our analysts, they are continually asking questions and interacting and working with our Academy staff, who are the true methodologists in terms of systematic review, conducting systematic reviews. And finally, they have to read every single article and analyze it. And they do that by completing the data extraction tool. They create the overview tables, and then they create the evidence summaries. And I'll show you examples of that. So this is just a screenshot from our data extraction tool, and you can see it's very structured. So we are able to do meta-analysis and other kinds of analyses to really look critically at the data that we're extracting from each of these papers. So you have standardized extraction fields, but you also have opportunity for free text. This really gives us a powerful tool to look systematically at all the studies side by side. Now, as part of that, in every systematic review, and this is standardized operating procedure for systematic reviews, each article goes beyond just having data extracted. It is also analyzed for risk of bias. And risk of bias are tools that assess the quality of the article's research. So instead of just simply pulling out data, you're actually assessing the quality of the research paper. And they do that in we have a specific quality of, we call it the QCC, or the quality checklist, and it is a tool that we have developed and validated, and it is used by all our analysts for every single paper. Now because, and I'll show you an example of this in just a second, but because it is done in a way that we don't want just one person analyzing the quality of that paper, we always have two separate independent analysts looking at the quality, the risk of bias tool for every paper. So let's take a look at how that goes. And so this is just talking about the evidence summary and the overview table, in which all of our projects, you can go on the website and click onto the overview table and see all the papers and all the information that was extracted from each of those papers on a table that allows you to compare and contrast the articles very similarly. And for people who use the evidence analysis library sometimes as a way of tapping into the literature on a particular topic for writing a paper or a grant or justifying a particular intervention that they're doing with their papers, these overview tables are an excellent resource for doing that kind of process. So I will show you an example of that. This is an example of an overview. It's just a small snapshot that usually they have a long list of studies. But here you can see how they can compare studies side by side. So you have Dennison et al. Compared to LaRoe et al. This is the risk of bias rating for each of the studies. Then you have the study design. You have the group or the national sample that they came from. You have the subject information. They were 2 or 5 years. You can see the men and women, and you can see it here as well. The type of juice, this was a study that was done on juice consumption, so you can see the type of juice included in each study. You can see the fruit juice intake units and how it was recorded, the data collection tool that each study used, and you can see, of course, they're different. The dependent variable that it was extracted from both, as well as the results. And so here they looked at vitamin A and vitamin C, and you can see the results. So it gives you a very nice way to compare and contrast all the literature that was included within the systematic review. All right, so let's take a look at the conclusion statement, which is the final result of our systematic reviews, and how we grade the strength of that supporting evidence. So the bottom line, a conclusion statement is the answer to that original PICO question based on the science that currently exists. And so if you think about it, it's not creating new evidence. So you're basing your answer on existing evidence that is found in the literature today. It is determined after the research is analyzed, and it's graded based on the quality of supporting evidence. So our lead analyst drafts the conclusion statement, but it's reviewed, approved, and then the grade is determined by our work group, which are those content experts again. So let's take a little example, a case study, and take a look at some of this. How does this relate to you? So let's say that a registered dietitian nutritionist is working with a 43-year-old male school teacher. This teacher has a BMI of 38 and hypertension. So our school teacher is very busy and teaches and coaches after school, but also has 2 small children and has really very little time to cook and is on a very tight food budget. So you are referred to this individual to help them lose weight and improve overall health. Now recall, as I just showed you, that EAL has systematic reviews that you can tap into. But what I have yet to show you is our evidence-based practice guidelines. So how do you know which is the best, what are the recommendations to help you have an evidence-based approach to your patient? All right, so let's start out and ask the question, in overweight adults, what energy expenditure equation should be used? So you want to make sure that you're using the right energy expenditure equation. So you come to the EAL, you click on it, and you see all the projects. The first project you see is adult weight management. So you click on that project to see if there's any recommendations for you that will help answer this question. Now, this is an evidence-based practice guideline project, and the way our projects for guidelines work is if you look to the left of the screen, you see that there's a listing of all different kinds of recommendations, introduction, executive summary for our adult weight management guidelines. At the top are the most recent guidelines, and if you went down the page, you would see older recommendations so that you could determine how far back are you willing to go with your evidence. So if you can see, this was published in 2014, which was a little bit ago, but not too old. So you click on the major recommendations button because you want to know what is it that you can do to answer your question about energy expenditure equations. So you'll get this long list of recommendations. First of all, we always have at the very top, which you can't see well, our medical nutrition therapy. We always ask the question of how effective is the registered dietitian nutritionist when using medical nutrition therapy in improving outcomes in this particular topic. So that would be the first thing you'd see. That would be the very top. From then we go nutrition screening and referral, and you can see there is a recommendation for that. We go to the nutrition assessment, and there's a whole list of recommendations regarding that. And then we have nutrition intervention, and what you can't see on this screenshot is our outcomes, our nutrition outcome monitoring and evaluation recommendations. But for this case study, we want to focus on assessing energy needs. So you can click on that and find out what the recommendations are in terms of assessing energy needs. So when you click on that, you're going to see a screen just exactly like the one I've shown you, only without the blue boxes. And it's going to say Recommendation Summary. And then under Quick Links, it'll show you the conclusion statement. And you'll remember that the conclusion statement is the results of the systematic review that informs the evidence-based practice guideline recommendations. So let's start there. Let's say, hey, I want to know what evidence informs this because in case I get asked, I want to have a list, a bibliography, a list of studies that can help support which energy expenditure equation I'm going to use. So you click on that and you will see the PICO question that was asked in overweight or obese adults. Which predictive equation for estimating resting metabolic rate should be used? Well, that's exactly what you want to know, so that's perfect. Then you have the conclusion statement below that, which was, as I told you, is a summary of the evidence that was reviewed and approved by our content expert work group. So in this case it says, the majority of research review supports the use of Mifflin-St. Jeor equation using actual body weight to predict resting metabolic rate in overweight or obese adults because it demonstrated good accuracy and correlation with indirect calorimetry. Other equations evaluated did not predict resting metabolic rate as accurately as Mifflin-St. Jeor. So that's terrific. So now you have a very clear, concise, evidence-based answer. And if you wanted that bibliography list, you could do two things. You could click on the evidence summary, which would give you both text descriptions of each of the papers reviewed, but also it would give you that overview table, which would allow you as a critical thinker to compare and contrast each of the studies that were used to formulate that conclusion statement. But also it's important to note that if you wanted to see the search plan, you could also click on that and go back and look at what their inclusion exclusion criteria was, what the databases were that they searched, what the years were that they allowed. And so that would really give you a comprehensive understanding of all the things that went into creating that conclusion statement. Finally, it's important to know how strong is the evidence, like how confident can I be in that conclusion statement. For this particular one, we have a grade 1, which is the highest level of strength you can have for a conclusion statement. And so let's take a little look at what those different grades are and what they mean. So this is just an explanation of our grades. As I said, grade 1 is the best, and that means that the evidence consists of results from studies of strong design for answering the research question, and not just one, but typically multiple. Fair, on the other hand, consists of results from studies of strong design answering the question addressed, but there is some uncertainty attached to the conclusion because of inconsistency among the results from the different studies. So you may have one study that was very strongly in this direction and another one that was less strong in that direction. So there's a little bit more inconsistency. That's a grade 2. Grade 3 means there's limited evidence. Grade 4 is considered expert opinion. And grade 5 means not assignable. There's no evidence available that directly supports or refutes. So it doesn't mean that it's wrong. It's just that you can neither confirm nor deny the conclusion statement. So that's an important interpretation of the grades that you will see for every conclusion statement. Okay, but you want to know what it recommends. You want to know what the guidelines recommend. So you can click on the blue arrow next to recommendation, and that will show you what it recommends. And so if you look down here, you will see that it says the use of Mifflin-St. Jeor equation to estimate resting metabolic rate, and it gives you a nice conclusion statement. Now, these evidence-based guidelines have their own ratings. So because this came from a grade 1 conclusion statement, it is a strong rating. But it only is conditional in meaning that if you have indirect telemetry, you certainly would use that versus Mifflin-St. Jeor, so that it's only used in certain conditions, and that's why they say conditional. All right, so here is the rating for the guidelines, which is different, as I said before, from the systematic review. A strong says it benefits clearly exceed the harms. The quality of the evidence is excellent, a grade 1 or 2. So you can kind of go down and see the difference. Remembering that a consensus is merely people coming together who are experts in a topic saying what they believe to be the right answer, but it is not based on an aggregation of evidence. Now, because nutrition, the world of nutrition research, there are lots of gaps. There are lots of things that we don't have evidence on. And so at that point, our practitioners need something to go forward with. So you will see recommendations that are consensus-based, because even though there's no evidence to give us a systematic review and a strong grade, we still need to provide some guidance for our practitioners. So you will see consensus recommendations as well as strong, fair, weak, and insufficient evidence altogether. Now, let's go back to our scenario. So here we, as a dietitian working with our patient, we have assessed his needs and had an in-depth discussion about his environment, the world this person is living in, time available, and cooking skills. And the dietitian says, well, I wonder if there's evidence that already prepared meals are effective in weight loss and weight maintenance. And so once again, you go back to our evidence analysis library. And over here on the right, you'll see there is a single serving portion meal sized meal and weight management. So there's a topic just on that. Now this is a standalone systematic review, and this is a screenshot from that. You can see again it was also published in 2014. And the PICO question that was asked was, in overweight or obese adults, what is the effect of consuming single-serving portion-sized meals on weight loss? And so you can again read the conclusion statement. The bottom line of that statement is that single-serving meals may be effective for weight loss, which is great. That means you have a evidence-based intervention approach for this individual with very little time on a very fixed budget. And again, the grade for this conclusion statement is a grade 1, meaning that there's good studies that you can find if you click on the evidence summary that will back up your intervention. So you're not doing something opinion-based, but it's very evidence-based. Again, you may say, well, what about energy intake? So is it just weight, or are there more benefits from this? So again, our PICO question is very specific. What is the effect of consuming single-serving portion-sized meals on energy intake? And again, a grade 1 conclusion statement that says single-serving meals may be effective for reducing energy intake. And again, you can click on the evidence summary and see the studies that were used to inform that. And finally, you want to know what is the effect of consuming these meals on compliance. And because we know that a maintenance of weight reduction is about compliance and adherence. And so you look at the evidence. Now this evidence isn't quite as strong. It's a grade 2, which is still good, but not as good as the grade 1. And so this conclusion indicates that single-serving meals may result in improved adherence to diet, but perhaps there's a little more inconsistency in the evidence provided. So you want to take a look and you want to say, well, I want to see the studies that were involved in creating those conclusion statements. And so you click on that overview table because perhaps you want to really dive deeper and provide the physician you're working with or others, your multidisciplinary team, with some of the papers so that they understand the evidence that you're supporting your intervention on. So you can see this is a nice overview table where we have the author, the year it was published, the study design. Again, this is the rating from the risk of bias tool. So all three of these studies that I'm showing on the screen had positive, meaning that they were well-conducted studies, which contributes to that grade 1 evidence from the conclusion statement. It tells you the type of studies. Again, these are randomized clinical trials, the interventions they were done. You can see it's got very detailed information on the intervention, the population, the outcomes that were looked at, and any limitations from the study. So it's a very detailed overview table that you can use as a clinician to let your team know you're basing your intervention off evidence. So finally, let's step back and remember that we talked about those 4 steps: the systematic review, we talked about the evidence-based practice guideline, we talked about practice and implementing practice and collecting outcomes. And so lots of busy practitioners do those. We get in, we assess our patient, we work with the patient, we implement an intervention, but then we don't always do the best job that we could on tracking our data to find out what works. And not just in an individual sense, but also in the aggregated sense, particularly individuals who are working with a lot of patients that have similar conditions. If you are a dietitian working in outpatient weight management or in inpatient oncology or cardiovascular disease, you may want to think about not only tracking individual patients' outcomes, but also then aggregating those and really thinking through how can I look at what I'm doing as a practitioner to ensure effectiveness. And so why should you track data? Because it allows you to summarize the results of the protocol that you used. So if I implemented these adult weight management recommendations, did they work for me? Did they show an improvement in outcome? Did my patient lose weight and become healthier? We have an increased body of knowledge regarding the medical nutrition therapy's effectiveness. If it's not effective, why not? We need to know these things. Also, it's excellent documentation for reimbursement. Certainly, you can also track your time and find out, where do you want to spend your time? Do you want to spend your time on doing huge amounts of assessment, or is it more effective for you to spend your time on the intervention and ensuring your patient really understands the intervention and can execute the intervention in their world? And of course, finally, it also indicates really the complexity of care. Nutrition is highly complex, that is very multifactorial, and by documenting this, you can really do that in a comprehensive way. So we at the Academy have also another web-based tool that is free to all members of the Academy and to all people with a credential of registered dietitian nutritionist. And it allows you to track data both on an individual but also on a group of individuals, patients, clients in the hospital, in the outpatient setting, and in the public health realm. And so I've given you here on the screen the web site. Go in there and be able to log on. And as I said, it's free, and it really will help you say, I'm implementing these guidelines. Are they effective in my practice? Am I able to see improvements in outcomes with my clients or patients? And so I strongly encourage you to go and investigate and look at our Andy tool. We feel it's highly effective. You can also use it on mobile devices. We've just upgraded that. So just as of the last week or so, that has been an upgrade and a change to it. So if you want to use it on your iPad or your Kindle or your phone, you're able to do that and be really interactive with your patients and still capturing outcomes. So there's also an additional web page that is the same exact one that I'm showing you on the screen, but after the slash it says info. And so you can then, there's little webinars and videos to show you how to use Andy, how to log in, how to capture your outcomes, how to create chart notes, etc. So I encourage you to take a look at that. So I will end there and open it up for questions. Thank you again very much for having me today. I really appreciate the opportunity to explain our evidence analysis library and all the resources there for registered dietitian nutritionists and the multidisciplinary team.
Thank you, Dr. Steiber, for a very enlightening and excellent webinar. We do have some questions, and I will now begin to ask them to you. Question number one, how do topics get submitted to the evidence library? Can anyone submit a question?
Absolutely, absolutely. On our webpage, there is a place that you can click where you can submit ideas for topics. Also, you can always email any of the staff and describe what you're interested in and why you want a particular topic. We do really leverage and utilize our evidence-based practice committee to help prioritize and determine which topics we're going to address next. As part of being on the Guideline Clearinghouse Network, where we try to make sure and update our existing guidelines every 5 years, so that is a major priority for us, but we are always open to new and important topics that our members are interested and care about.
Thank you. Second question, how do you prioritize the systematic review topics?
Well, so as I said just a moment ago, our evidence-based practice committee really helps us do that. But there are many considerations to take into account. The Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics funds the vast majority of the work that is done on our evidence analysis library. We do also receive funding from other sources, but the vast majority, over 95%, is really done by the Academy. And so how much funding we have for the fiscal year matters. It also takes into account how recently we've updated a topic, and then certainly how relevant it is to our membership.
Okay, thank you. Question number three, is the evidence library used for dietary guidelines or other policy efforts?
That's such a good question. So historically, now I don't know exactly what's going to happen the next iteration of the dietary guidelines because they are revising their process. But historically, there was a sister process, and I call it sister because it was really a very similar process to ours, but it was run by the Center for Nutrition and Public Policy, which is under the USDA, and it was called the National Evidence Library. And so it was what did the dietary guidelines for Americans. And so it was much more population and health-based. And then our evidence analysis library was a little more focused on clinical or outpatient. Now that's changing and we're broadening our focus. But I don't know what will happen in the future to the dietary guidelines of America and what they will utilize.
Thank you. Next question. Do you need to be an A&D member to access the EPL?
No, you do not. It is important to note that our membership does get this as a free resource. However, you can always buy a subscription, and we have different organizations. We have different countries, their dietetic associations actually purchase subscriptions for their members, and certainly an individual person can buy a subscription. Absolutely.
Thank you. Will you please give us the next question? Will you please give us some details about when public health and what topics will be added to the EAL?
So I don't have a lot of detail on that yet. This is an area that we're strongly moving in for the evidence analysis library, looking at topics that impact public health, but we have yet to prioritize those topics. And so one that I can absolutely tell you that will be redone and expanded upon is the topic of breastfeeding. And that's a topic that we're very vested in and will be absolutely doing. We have not determined the rest. If you, whoever's asking this question, has opinions about that, please feel free to email us at the Evidence Analysis Library and give us your opinion because we're very open to that. This is a new topic or new area for us, and so we're just beginning to explore what the priorities are.
Okay, thank you. Next question. You mentioned the risk of bias is assessed for studies. What variables are considered, and can you tell us more about the funding source?
Absolutely. So risk of bias tools. So risk of bias is something, and there are many tools out there that are for risk of bias. And usually they are done by study design. So for example, if you're analyzing a study that is a randomized clinical trial, there is a specific risk of bias tool for that study design. And you look at everything from how the subjects were recruited, the methodology of the study, did the study design, was it good for the research question? You look at the statistics that were done within the study. You look at the results and how clearly they were described in the study. And so it goes through, really it's about evaluating the execution of the study, everything from the population and recruitment all the way through the data analysis and report. And then the second part of that was about funding, I believe. So for every single one of our projects, when you go to the home page of the project where it gives the beginning overview of the project, you can see the funding source for every single one of our projects. Our evidence-based practice guidelines are only funded by the Academy. We do not have external funding from any sources outside the Academy for the guidelines, but there are some external sources for a standalone systematic review. And so you can see the exact funding sources for each of our individual projects clearly delineated on the website, on the evidence analysis website.
Thank you. Next question or comment. I'm having difficulty locating the overview tables that are referred to in the EAL.
Right. So what you do is you go under the evidence summary part, and if you scroll all the way down to the bottom of that, because at the top there's kind of a text description, a paragraph by paragraph description of each study that was included in the analysis, but at the bottom of that there will be a table, and you could click on it and it'll pop out into its own separate window, and you can either you can copy it or you can put it use it however you would like, print it off, but it's at the very bottom of the evidence summary section.
Thank you. The next one is 2 comments and then a question. Excellent information! Exclamation point. Thank you for your time. Do you know if the library would qualify for any CEUs for self-study?
There are tutorials on the EAL website that I believe are for CEU. And you can go on there and there are videos, and then you have questions to answer afterwards, and you can submit them and you get a certificate, and you can use that for CEUs.
Thank you. Next comment and question. Excellent. I did not understand the difference between the library and ANDI.
Oh, sure.
A-N-D-I-I.
So they are two. Yes. So they are 2 separate functions. Yeah, they are. One is the Evidence Analysis Library, which is andeal.org, and so you can go to that, and there is the screenshots that I showed during the presentation that have all the different projects. ANDI is a completely separate platform, and it's andhii.org, and it is a data capture system. So the EAL provides you information and evidence to inform your practice. The ANDI tool allows you to capture data from your practice. What assessment parameters did you do and what was the results? For example, I did a body mass index and it was 37. You put that into BMI 37. Dietary assessment, you did a 24-hour recall and the saturated fat was high. You can put the amount of saturated fat and indicate that it was high. Then those assessments are entered into the process, and there's built-in decision logic, and it will help you determine what's the nutrition diagnosis. And then you select the nutrition diagnosis you believe is happening with your patient. That will lead you to your intervention and allow you to track and monitor prospectively your outcomes. It also helps you generate your nutrition note, and it allows you to do it in multiple formats, whether it's a paragraph format or this old soap note or the a dime, so that it can interface and be used to copy and paste into your electronic medical record or whatever you use to document. So it is as an adjunct resource to your current documentation process that allows you to track and graph your practice and your outcomes.
Thank you. Next question. How would you use EAL to determine the best way to determine the need for supplemental protein?
Well, that's a good question. I don't think that we have a standalone protein topic, although we have definitely talked about that. So you might have to come at it from the perspective of your population. So if you're working with a pediatric population or a population in oncology or diabetes, you would go into those guidelines. So you're try to come at it from the angle of your population and then look under either assessment or intervention for protein as part of the question, and that will help you find the evidence.
Thank you. I'm afraid we're just about out of time, so we're going to have to stop after this next question and give some more logistical information. So here's the final question. Is there a relationship with the position papers and EAL?
What a wonderful question to end on. So historically there was not. However, that's absolutely changing right now. We are merging the two processes so that in the future all our position papers will be based off systematic reviews and have either a grade 2, 1 or 2 conclusion statements. Otherwise, if it has less than that level of evidence, we will now consider them, move them into being consensus papers, so that those processes will be more robust and more merged.
Thank you. Very interesting grouping of questions. Clearly, there are diverse uses for the evidence library, and today's webinar was very useful in terms of helping people understand exactly how to use the library. So thank you very much, Dr. Steiber. Now if we can get our computer to move to the next slide. All right, here we go. So this is a repeat of the objectives. We gave these at the beginning. This is part of the CEU process. So based on this webinar, the participants should be able to do the following things. Number one, proficiently search and find evidence analyses pertinent to your practice. Number two, interpret the analysis to determine the strength of evidence behind the research question. Number three, translate findings to practice by review of a case study on efficacy of single-serve meals on weight management. Number four, apply the learnings to improve the recommendations and education you give to clients. So I would now like to turn the webinar back over to my colleague, Amy Continelli, who will repeat some of the logistical details. Amy.
Thank you, Dr. Rippey. A link to obtain your continuing education credit certificate will be available on our website and emailed to you within 2 days. Today's webinar will be available to download within 2 days at ConAgraNutrition.com. If you have any questions or are missing your certificate, feel free to email me. And we do have recent CEU webinars archived at the ConAgra Nutrition website, Meta-Training, Diet Pattern, and Health, an update from the FDA on the revised Nutrition Facts Panel, Diet, Microbiome, and Health, Past, Present, and Future. Thank you, Dr. Rippey.
As I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, today's webinar is part of an ongoing series, the ConAgra Nutrition NutriBite webinar series. We do a webinar approximately every 3 months, and we have the next one selected. It will be delivered on December 7th, 2017, by Dr. Kelly Casaval, and the title will be Exploring the Evidence on Dietary Patterns, the Interplay of What We Eat and Health. The ability to register for that webinar, these are given 2 to 3 p.m. EST, 1 to 2 p.m. CST. The ability to register for that webinar will be available on our website within the next few days. So before we conclude today, and also thank Dr. Stiber for an outstanding webinar, we'd like to ask, first of all, thank all of our participants for giving of your valuable time to this important educational endeavor. We'd also like you to stay on the line for about 1 minute to give us some feedback about how we're doing. It'll only take about a minute, and these are very useful for us both in terms of grading the webinar and also suggesting topics for future webinars. So please stay on and take that survey. It's very important to us. And again, Dr. Stiber, thanks for a very enlightening and useful webinar and a really important initiative that the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics has undertaken now for many years. And thanks to all of our participants for giving us of your valuable time.